Racist pilot disrespects black woman. The next day, she personally signs his termination letter. A hush stretched across the busy terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport when a tall man in a pristine Delta Airlines pilot uniform brushed brusquely past an elegant black woman. Her poise and quiet confidence seemed to draw invisible lines of tension between them. Around them, passengers bustled, but an unsettling undercurrent brewed the moment their eyes locked, one filled with disdain on his part and quiet resolve on hers. Neither realized, in that charged instant, how fate would entwine them. By the next day, the same pilot who exuded unchecked arrogance would stand face to face with his greatest reckoning, orchestrated by the woman he disrespected. Randall Patterson remembered the hum of jet engines in his earliest childhood memories. Born and raised in a small rural town in northern Georgia, he grew up near an airfield that dotted the horizon with the silhouettes of propeller planes. His father, a mechanic at the local airport, instilled in him a deep fascination for flight. Young Randall spent weekends clutching chain-link fences, marveling at takeoffs and landings. By the time he was 8, he had memorized the make and model of every plane that frequented the tiny runway. That passion guided him through adolescence. While his peers tinkered with hobbies that fell in and out of fashion, Randall remained steadfast in his ambition to become a commercial airline pilot. With disciplined focus, he earned strong grades and won a scholarship to a respected aviation program. By his mid-20s, he had flown small cargo planes, commuter aircraft, and eventually caught his big break at Delta Airlines. Each rung of the ladder gave him the sense of conquering the skies that once enchanted him as a child by the fence. Beneath his confident smile, however, lay insecurities that would cast long shadows. Despite his skill in the cockpit, Randall found it difficult to connect with people on a personal level. He blamed certain missed promotions on politics. Every time a co-worker rose to a new position, he deemed it favoritism rather than introspecting on his own attitude. Slowly, frustrations built into resentment. Over time, biases he'd absorbed perhaps from offhand remarks in his hometown or from specific encounters that left him jaded began to crystallize in his personality. He found himself silently judging people he considered outsiders. Sometimes it was a quiet disapproval, other times it simmered into outright contempt. Within the structured hierarchy of the airline, Randall felt secure because he knew that a pilot's performance was measured by safety, punctuality, and skill. He maintained that standard impeccably. For years, he collected accolades, Safe Pilot Award, recognition for on-time departures, and a near-flawless safety record. These achievements seemed, at least to him, to justify his growing arrogance. But rumors spread behind the galley curtains. Flight attendants whispered that Captain Patterson could be difficult, unapproachable, or unpleasant. A few vague complaints landed on the desks of managers. Randall was called in once or twice for a half-hearted discussion, but nothing stuck. He continued to fly with an unwavering sense of superiority, rarely questioning how his words, his tone, and his sneers affected those around him. As commercial aviation evolved to emphasize customer experience and inclusivity, Randall scoffed. He believed such corporate initiatives distracted from real flying. "I'm paid to get people safely from point A to point B," he'd say, rolling his eyes when faced with new training about empathy, cultural differences, or conflict resolution. Each mandatory session felt to him like a waste of time. Privately, he saw it as an assault on real pilots, tough men who commanded the cockpit. The industry's shift to diversity, to nurturing female pilots, and to opening doors for underrepresented groups felt like an erosion of traditions he held dear. Yet he never acknowledged that such traditions often catered to a specific demographic. That blind spot grew bigger each year. Some colleagues recognized flashes of Randall's deeper prejudice, a smirk when hearing a foreign accent, a grumble when assisting non-English-speaking passengers, a pointed remark about affirmative action hires whenever a new black flight officer joined the ranks. These attitudes didn't always surface in big, overt ways, but they simmered, occasionally erupting in passive-aggressive remarks. His superiors, fixated on flight metrics, let it slide time and again. Within Randall Patterson's personal life, the cracks in his veneer were less visible. He was married, though that relationship had begun to strain under the weight of his perpetual discontent. When Sandra, his wife, tried to broach the topic of his negativity, Randall deflected. He insisted he was simply a realist, someone who didn't sugarcoat situations. Friends grew distant. He rarely attended social gatherings unless they involved other pilots, and even then, he'd quietly nurse a drink, seemingly aloof. By the time he neared his 20th year at Delta, Randall was firmly set in his ways. He had the near-legendary status of a pilot with an impeccable flight record, but little else. Junior pilots found him intimidating. Flight attendants dreaded flying with him more than twice in a row, and he had a habit of micromanaging the cockpit, leaving co-pilots little room to breathe. Yet the airline, keen on retaining experienced captains, had never taken decisive action. In Randall's mind, he was untouchable. High seniority, strong union support, a perfect safety record, these were the shields he believed would protect him from any storm. Perhaps on some level, he sensed his irritability had started to push boundaries. But deep inside, he convinced himself that if any real threat arose, he could weather it. He had no clue how drastically life was about to upend his assumptions. Maya Caldwell stepped into the bustling lobby of the Federal Aviation Administration's Southeastern Regional Office with the self-assured stride of someone who had earned her place in every room she entered. She didn't just work at the FAA, she was one of its rising stars, an aviation consultant, specialized in crew training, oversight, and policy development. Although she was a contractor rather than a permanent employee, her expertise was sought by multiple airlines and government agencies alike. Growing up in Atlanta, Maya developed an early fascination with planes. Her parents often took her to watch the activity around Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, letting the roar of departing jets become her lullaby. That passion extended into her teens, although she didn't become a pilot. Instead, she found a calling in the operational and regulatory side of aviation. She graduated near the top of her class from Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, focusing on aviation management and human factors. The balance between engineering marvels and the complex tapestry of human interactions drew her deeper into the field. She soon discovered a particular interest in conflict resolution and cultural awareness training. Years earlier, a minor onboard confrontation had almost escalated into a massive brawl on a flight she'd taken as a college intern. Observing how quickly misunderstandings could spiral at 35,000 feet, Maya made it her life's work to ensure that flight crews were better trained, both in technical and interpersonal skills. Over the years, she became renowned for her seminars that combined data, psychology, and empathetic conversation techniques to reduce tension in the cockpit and cabin. One success story involved transforming how an airline's flight attendants managed passenger disputes, leading to a 30% drop in reported incidents. Another saw the revamping of pilot training modules to include real-life scenarios on bias awareness, especially focusing on language barriers and cultural sensitivities. Maya's methods, at their core, championed safety through respect. She believed that every passenger counted, every voice mattered, and that a culturally aware flight crew could mean the difference between chaos and calm in a crisis. Her path, however, wasn't without hurdles. Even in progressive corners of the aviation industry, she encountered skepticism from men and women alike who questioned the validity of soft skills. She faced whispered critiques that it was all feel-good fluff. Others bristled at her focus on race, gender, and cultural backgrounds, preferring a one-size-fits-all approach. Yet, time and data validated her approach. Through gentle persistence and a foundation of empirical evidence, she won over many detractors. Being a black woman in a space still dominated by white men was not always easy. Maya recalled her first big industry conference where she delivered a keynote about bridging cultural gaps in aviation. Half the audience seemed enthralled. The other half wore polite but skeptical expressions. She pressed forward, using statistics and real-life case studies to illustrate the direct correlation between crew communication and passenger safety. After the talk, a cluster of airline executives approached her, impressed by how she turned a traditionally soft subject into a tangible operational benefit. That moment changed her trajectory, leading to multiple consulting offers, including one with the FAA. Despite her success, Maya remained humble. She viewed each day as an opportunity to learn, to refine her methods, and to uphold the core principle that respect saved lives. In private, she was warm, quick-witted, and cherished moments with friends, most of whom were from different walks of life outside aviation. She nurtured close bonds with her parents, who still lived in Atlanta's suburbs. Occasionally, she'd take them out for dinner, celebrating her successes as much as theirs, for they provided unwavering support through all the microaggressions and outright challenges she'd faced. At the heart of Maya's passion was an unyielding determination. If she witnessed an injustice, she spoke up. If she saw a process that endangered or marginalized anyone, she sought solutions. Over time, she developed the confidence to stand her ground when confronted by skeptics, bigots, or people who simply feared change. So when she received a message about an upcoming meeting in New York that would require her to fly up from Atlanta to discuss next steps in a nationwide pilot training overhaul, she was excited. She'd be at the helm of a working group set to implement new modules on cultural competency. Maya saw it as another opportunity to ensure the industry marched toward a safer, more inclusive future. Little did she know that on this particular journey, she was about to cross paths with someone who epitomized all the entrenched prejudices she spent her life combating. Nor could she predict that in less than 24 hours, the full force of her principles and her influence would converge on a single individual who mistook her calm composure for weakness. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, often lauded as the busiest airport in the world, felt like a modern-day bazaar where thousands of travelers weaved through concourses every hour. Maya arrived early for her flight to LaGuardia. She carried a sleek roller bag and a black tote that contained her laptop and essential documents. With practiced efficiency, she navigated security and found her way to Gate 17, where Delta Flight 384 would soon board. Meanwhile, in the pilot's lounge, Captain Randall Patterson finished reviewing the flight plan. On paper, everything looked routine. A Boeing 737 with a standard passenger load, clear weather en route, except for some potential wind shear near New York. He rubbed his temples, a habit he'd developed whenever he felt an undercurrent of agitation. The day before, he'd had a disagreement with a manager about updated training modules that required additional simulator time for cultural scenarios. He'd labeled it corporate overreach. The manager politely suggested that if Randall wanted to keep his flight schedule intact, he needed to complete the modules. That small exchange left him simmering with frustration. His first officer for this flight, a younger pilot named Kevin Stone, approached with a tablet. Kevin was an affable man in his early 30s, eager to learn from a seasoned captain. He respected Randall's expertise but knew of his reputation. As they walked to the gate, Kevin commented on the passenger manifest. "Full flight," he noted. "We have about 180 passengers today, including a few with special needs. Expect a tight boarding process." Randall nodded briskly, ignoring Kevin's attempt at small talk. "Everything else good to go?" "All set, Captain," Kevin replied, burying any disappointment in his senior's curt manner. Outside, passengers had begun to gather around Gate 17. Maya found a seat near a window, preferring to keep an eye on the activity on the tarmac. A Boeing 737 waited at the jetway, and her eyes lingered on its livery-crisp Delta colors that had once sparked her childhood dreams. Next to her, a group of business travelers chatted animatedly about corporate meetings in Manhattan. A couple wrangled a toddler who kept giggling and running in circles. The atmosphere was typical pre-flight chaos, but Maya thrived in these busy airport scenes. They reminded her how aviation connected lives across the globe. The gate agent, a middle-aged woman with a friendly disposition, announced pre-boarding for travelers needing assistance. A few wheelchair-using passengers and parents with infants lined up. Maya glanced at her phone, checking flight times and her itinerary for the next day. She made a mental note to review a final set of slides for the meeting once she settled in her seat. Then she noticed two pilots approaching the gate. The older one walked with a purposeful stride, shoulders squared. She recognized the captain epaulets on his uniform. The younger pilot followed, glancing at the overhead monitors before heading straight into the jet bridge. Maya watched the older pilot from a distance. His brow was furrowed, as though the entire world had become an annoyance. She'd seen that expression on certain faces in her line of work, those who considered passengers little more than cargo to be flown from point to point. When the gate agent announced general boarding, Maya took her place in line, receiving a small nod from the agent who scanned her digital boarding pass. She stepped onto the jet bridge, the hum of the aircraft's ventilation system growing louder with each step. A flight attendant greeted her warmly at the door. Maya responded with a bright smile. She always made an effort to be courteous to flight attendants, knowing how challenging their roles could be. The first-class cabin still had a few seats open, and Maya found hers on the aisle. She stowed her roller bag in the overhead bin, then settled in with her tote under the seat. A flight attendant offered pre-departure beverages, and Maya requested a glass of water, politely declining the orange juice or champagne. She needed clarity for the final read-through of her next day's agenda. Over the par, Captain Patterson's voice crackled. He welcomed everyone aboard Delta Flight 384, estimated flight time around 2 hours. Weather mostly cooperative, aside from potential crosswinds upon landing. His voice was calm, practiced exactly what one might expect from a seasoned pilot. Yet even in that brief introduction, Maya caught the slightest tinge of impatience, like a man fulfilling a chore rather than addressing hundreds of people who entrusted him with their lives. She shrugged the feeling away, attributing it to her heightened sensitivity from years of analyzing pilot behaviors. It was a flight like any other, or so she thought. One more hop in the air, one more trip in a long line of journeys. She had no inkling that she was about to come face to face with a collision of values at 35,000 feet no less, that would forever alter one pilot's destiny and her own perspective on the power she wielded in the industry. Within minutes of takeoff, the Boeing 737 roared skyward, climbing steadily above Atlanta's skyline. Maya gazed out the window at the city's diminishing lights, then returned to her documents. Her mind drifted to the upcoming meeting, mentally rehearsing how she would present new data on how crew member respect directly correlated with reduced in-flight incidents. She believed the future of aviation safety wasn't just about hardware, it was about hearts and minds. Up in the cockpit, Captain Randall Patterson let the autopilot handle the climb. Next to him, Kevin Stone monitored instruments and frequencies. The flight progressed smoothly. Randall performed his tasks by rote, his mastery evident. Under normal circumstances, the flight would continue with minimal drama, but an undercurrent of irritation gnawed at him. He recalled the mandatory cultural sensitivity modules waiting for him next week. More time in the simulator when I could be flying real routes, he grumbled to himself. He said nothing to Kevin, though. Over the intercom, a flight attendant announced the start of the beverage service. In first class, a different attendant approached Maya with a friendly smile, offering her a menu for dinner options. Maya thanked her, scanning the choices: chicken, pasta, or a vegetarian risotto. She decided on the risotto, returning the menu with another polite smile. Several rows ahead, another passenger, an older gentleman, was having difficulty stowing his bag. The flight attendant assisting him seemed to be having trouble too. The gentleman spoke in a Spanish accent, and there was a bit of a language gap. Maya, who was conversationally fluent in Spanish thanks to a minor in college, overheard and offered help. With a few gentle words, she translated the attendant's instructions, and soon the bag was stowed safely. The attendant thanked Maya profusely, impressed by her quick intervention. Meanwhile, Randall Patterson emerged from the cockpit for a routine stretch and restroom break. Passing through the first-class cabin, he instantly noticed Maya's involvement in the seat bin situation. He didn't recognize her role in bridging the language gap. He simply saw her stand up and gesture toward the overhead bin. For a moment, he suspected a conflict. When the flight attendant told him quietly that Maya had helped, he gave a curt nod. Still, something about Maya's air of confidence stirred his annoyance. He couldn't pinpoint why, but the dynamic this poised black woman, elegantly dressed, assisting a passenger in Spanish, fueled his suspicion that she might be one of those travelers who took it upon herself to run the show. He'd seen a handful of well-to-do passengers who liked to flaunt their knowledge or self-importance. In his eyes, she was probably the type who'd whine over any mild inconvenience. Returning from the lavatory, he passed her seat again, just as she was sliding her tray table out. The flight attendant was complimenting her language skills. Maya responded casually, "I'm happy to help. Communication can be the best safety tool we have up here." Her words carried an unmistakable ring of authority. She had seen enough flights to know the smallest misunderstanding could lead to bigger issues. Randall felt a knot of distaste coil in his gut. He had no rational reason to resent her, yet the seeds of bias found fertile ground in his mood. Instead of returning to the cockpit quietly, he paused in the aisle. Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone skating on the edge of hostility. Maya looked up, surprised. "No, Captain. Just helping the gentleman with his overhead bag. Everything is fine." He narrowed his eyes slightly. "Flight attendants are here for that," he said, ignoring the fact that she'd actually eased the attendant's job. Maya noticed the subtle challenge in his tone, but she was too level-headed to engage in a confrontation. She offered a polite smile. "Of course. I was just lending a hand. It's all settled." Randall's jaw tightened. "If you need anything else, let the crew know," he muttered before turning away. She tracked his retreating form, unsettled by the tension in his voice. For the next half hour, Maya tried to shake off the encounter. She ate her risotto, though her appetite waned. Why had he appeared so suspicious? She'd done nothing out of the ordinary. She decided not to read too much into a single moment. After all, not every pilot excelled at passenger engagement. Yet that uneasy feeling grew stronger when, later in the flight, the same flight attendant confided in Maya that Captain Patterson could be difficult at times. "Just between you and me," the attendant whispered, "I've had flights with him before. He's not exactly Mr. Warmth." Maya nodded, understanding all too well the subtleties that define difficult. She returned to her notes for the next day's meeting, forcing herself to focus on broader goals. People like Patterson, she reasoned, were exactly why the new training modules existed in the first place. If he was simply curt or socially awkward, it was one thing, but if there was deeper prejudice lurking beneath, that could jeopardize many aspects of safety and customer care. Unaware of these thoughts, Randall stayed in the cockpit the rest of the flight, barking the occasional order to Kevin. As they began the descent into LaGuardia, he felt a prick of worry about the turbulence reports. He performed a textbook approach, landing with the smoothness of a consummate professional. Over the PAR, he announced their arrival time and gate number, yet his mind lingered on the image of that composed woman in first class, the one who seemed to speak with such surety. Without having a name or an official reason, he already disliked her. Something about her presence reminded him of everything he resented, the modern face of aviation that demanded courtesy and respect for all. That, ironically, was precisely why fate would soon place her in a position that would upend his world. LaGuardia Airport welcomed them with the usual hustle. The moment the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers sprang from their seats, collecting bags and waiting for the forward door to open. Maya watched the jostling lines, choosing to remain seated until the immediate rush subsided. She sensed an undercurrent of relief from some flight attendants, as though they were glad the flight had arrived without any real drama. Captain Patterson performed his standard shutdown procedures, conferring briefly with Kevin Stone. Then he slipped out of the cockpit, letting Kevin handle the final checks. Normally, the captain might stand at the flight deck door to say goodbye to first-class passengers. But Randall had no inclination to do so this time. He ducked into the jet bridge corridor, making a quick phone call to confirm his hotel reservation. Passengers in first class filed out without seeing him. When Maya disembarked, she exchanged friendly farewells with the flight attendants, who recognized her kind gestures during the trip. She stepped onto the jet bridge, the crisp New York air mixing with the metallic airport smell. Her phone buzzed with notifications, welcome texts from colleagues already in Manhattan, a reminder about an Uber waiting zone. Farther down the terminal, Randall concluded his phone call. He spotted Maya in the stream of disembarking passengers, her poised stride marking her as someone on a mission. A flicker of annoyance lanced through him, though he still couldn't articulate why. He turned away, heading for the crew exit. In a matter of minutes, both parted ways, completely oblivious that they would soon meet again, under far more dramatic circumstances. Outside, LaGuardia's swirl of taxis, ride-shares, and buses played out like a chaotic ballet. Maya found her pre-booked car, sliding into the back seat with a polite greeting to the driver. It was a short ride into Manhattan, where her hotel towered near Midtown. She checked in smoothly, then headed to her room, setting down her luggage and taking in the cityscape from a 20th floor window. Deep in thought, she recalled the flight's tension. Something felt off about the captain. She'd encountered many serious, no-nonsense pilots over the years, some with little patience for passenger banter. But Captain Patterson's demeanor was more than brusque. The subtle glare, the condescending tone, the undercurrent that seemed to bubble up whenever he was around her. She couldn't pinpoint if it was outright racism or just garden variety arrogance. Still, her intuition nagged at her. She reminded herself that she was in New York for a purpose. Tomorrow's meeting at the FAA's local office was key to rolling out new guidelines for pilot training in soft skills. Maya planned to cite real incidents showing how hostility or even mild neglect could escalate tensions on board. But she needed rest first. That night, After a quick meal at the hotel restaurant, she slipped into bed, drafting a mental list of items to finalize in the morning. A swirl of questions occupied her thoughts. How many more Captain Pattersons were out there? Individuals with impeccable flight records, yet an utter lack of respect for the people in their care. The notion troubled her enough that she resolved to fold a mention of her flight experience into tomorrow's meeting, if relevant. She rarely singled out a person in her professional work, but she knew that anecdotal evidence often clarified the need for these training programs. Meanwhile, across town in a more modest hotel, Randall Patterson sank onto his bed. He rummaged through his bag, double-checking that he had no outstanding tasks. He'd fly out again in 2 days, returning to Atlanta. In the back of his mind, a lingering worry about mandatory training flickered. Tomorrow, he had a day off. Maybe he'd see a show or just rest. But the uneasy feeling that the airline was pushing him toward changes he despised wouldn't leave him. His own prejudices and frustrations churned like unsettled water, but he couldn't see them clearly for what they were. Though neither realized it, a fateful alignment of circumstances was taking shape. Maya's involvement in FAA policy, combined with Randall's open disdain, set a collision course. It was as though the last flight was merely a prelude, a small overture of tension that would crescendo by tomorrow, changing both of their lives forever. Bright morning sunlight spilled across Manhattan's streets. Maya arrived at the FAA's local office, a modern high-rise in the heart of the city, feeling a surge of professional energy. She carried a slim briefcase containing her laptop and final notes. In the elevator, she stood with other aviation professionals, some from airlines, others from regulatory bodies. They greeted each other with nods and murmured pleasantries. The conference room on the 15th floor was set up with a large oval table. Representatives from several major airlines, including Delta, were present, as well as FAA officials. Maya's role was to present the latest research on how pilot attitudes and interpersonal skills impacted flight safety and passenger satisfaction. She was slated to speak second on the agenda after a brief introduction by the regional director. 10 minutes into the session, she took her place at the front. Her voice, clear and calm, carried across the table. She used slides filled with data points, from flight attendant testimonies about pilot hostility to passenger surveys indicating that respectful treatment correlated with fewer mid-air disputes. Maya highlighted a few near incidents that were diffused by empathetic communication. The audience listened intently, some nodding in agreement. But there was a particular hush when Maya mentioned an incident the day before, a subtle but telling moment aboard a Delta flight from Atlanta to New York. Though she didn't use the pilot's name, she gave a brief, anonymized description. I witnessed a captain who seemed to resent a passenger me simply for assisting another passenger in Spanish. His tone and body language suggested significant hostility, which could escalate under different circumstances. As she spoke, Kim Delaney, a Delta corporate liaison in attendance, perked up. She'd heard through the grapevine about a pilot rumored to be difficult, possibly the same one Maya was describing. Anxiety flickered across Kim's features. She made a note to speak with Maya privately after the session. Maya concluded her presentation with a direct statement. If we ignore these subtle forms of discrimination or discourtesy, we allow them to fester. This meeting is about finding solutions that ensure every cockpit and cabin fosters respect, because respect is not separate from safety, it is safety. The room filled with a muted applause. The tone was serious, the message striking. Then the meeting pivoted to practical discussions on how to integrate these training modules. Kim Delaney interjected from time to time, promising Delta's commitment to reviewing any complaints thoroughly. Maya appreciated the gesture, but she knew from experience that words weren't always followed by action. During the lunch break, Kim approached Maya in a side hallway, offering a handshake and a warm smile. "I'm Kim Delaney from Delta's Compliance Division. Thank you for that presentation. I'd love to hear more about the incident you mentioned." Maya assessed Kim's expression. She seemed earnest, possibly open to addressing the issue rather than burying it. "Sure," Maya responded, stepping aside to let others pass. "I didn't provide names because I don't want to single anyone out prematurely. But it was Delta Flight 384 yesterday. Captain Patterson, if I'm not mistaken." Kim's eyes flickered in recognition. "Randall Patterson. He's been with the company for a while. I've heard, well, let's just say I'm aware of certain concerns." She grimaced. "If you're comfortable, would you consider filing a formal complaint? Our HR can initiate an investigation, and we can escalate it to flight operations if needed." Maya hesitated. Part of her disliked being involved in a formal complaint process. She was here to propose solutions for systemic improvement, not to target individuals. But she also knew that ignoring the problem allowed individuals like Patterson to continue. "I'll do it," she said, "as long as it's handled professionally. I'm not looking for retribution, only accountability." Kim nodded. "Delta takes this seriously, especially if it involves any hint of racial bias. We'll treat your statement with due diligence." They exchanged contact information. Maya gave a short written statement that afternoon, outlining the pilot's unnecessary hostility, the context, and her role at the FAA. By the end of the day, Kim had escalated it to her superiors at Delta. At first, the higher-ups were cautious. Randall Patterson was a long-time captain with a clean operational record. But the moment they realized Maya Caldwell was not just any passenger, but a high-level FAA consultant, alarm bells rang. The chain of events moved swiftly from that point. Delta's flight operations manager, who had a stack of unaddressed or inconclusive complaints against Patterson, saw an opportunity to address the simmering problem head-on. He ordered a thorough review of Patterson's HR file and discovered multiple incident memos from flight attendants citing his abrasive behavior. Some included hints of racial or ethnic prejudice. By the time Kim Delaney concluded her follow-up, it was clear that Randall Patterson's luck had finally run out. The next step was an internal hearing, accelerated by the gravity of the FAA's involvement. Randall Patterson, oblivious at that moment, was about to face a reckoning that would shake his world to its core. While Maya concluded her day with colleagues, Randall Patterson spent his day off exploring parts of Manhattan half-heartedly. He tried to enjoy the city, but a nagging sense of dissatisfaction followed him. He avoided socializing with flight crews, preferring to eat alone at a diner near Times Square. That evening, he retreated to his hotel room early, flipping channels aimlessly before falling into a restless sleep. The next morning, he reported back to LaGuardia for his scheduled return flight. Usually, he enjoyed morning flights, less chance of congested air traffic. But his phone buzzed repeatedly with work emails, one of which flagged a new message from his base manager in Atlanta. The subject line read, "Urgent, Compliance and HR Meeting." Randall frowned, tapping the message. It stated he was required to attend a mandatory review upon landing in Atlanta. His chest tightened. Sure, he'd had the occasional run-in with management, but urgent meetings were rare. He tried to brush it off, telling himself it was likely about the new cultural training modules. Perhaps they were pushing compliance more aggressively, and he'd have to go through another set of mandatory classes. He inhaled deeply, dismissing the flicker of anxiety. The flight back to Atlanta was unremarkable, a Boeing 737 with a moderate load of passengers, mostly business travelers returning home. Randall performed the takeoff and climb with textbook precision. His first officer, a mild-mannered woman named Samantha Lee, handled the radio communications. Randall's mood was brittle, though. He responded curtly to Samantha's attempts at conversation, burying his stress in rigid focus on the flight instruments. 2 hours later, they touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Randall taxied to the gate, performed the usual shutdown tasks, and gave a terse nod to Samantha before exiting the plane. As he walked through the terminal toward the Pilot Operations Center, he noticed a few flight attendants who ordinarily greeted him with polite formality now offered only quick, tight-lipped smiles. Something felt off, as if word had spread about him. Inside the operations center, his base manager, Greg Hansen, waited with a stony expression. Next to Greg stood an HR representative, Danielle Bates, who specialized in employee relations. Greg gestured for Randall to follow them to a small conference room. Once inside, the manager closed the door. "Captain Patterson," Greg began, his voice formal, "do you know why we've called you here today?" Randall swallowed, feigning nonchalance. "I assume it's about some procedural updates. Or maybe the new training modules." Greg exchanged a glance with Danielle, then turned back to Randall. "We've received a formal complaint about your conduct toward a passenger. The passenger is an FAA consultant. She's reported behavior that suggests bias and hostility. We also have multiple corroborating statements from flight attendants." Randall's stomach lurched. He recalled the incident with that black woman. "I don't know what she told you, but it's exaggerated," he said, arms crossing defensively. "I didn't threaten anyone. Maybe I was a bit stern." Danielle cleared her throat. "The complaint states that you approached her in an accusatory manner for assisting another passenger. The FAA consultant perceived your tone as hostile and racially charged. Combined with previous memos in your file, we're obligated to launch a full investigation." Randall's eyes widened. "Previous memos? No one ever told me about that." "They were informal," Greg replied. "Flight attendants occasionally reported your behavior, which we documented but never escalated. However, this FAA involvement changes the stakes. It's not just an internal matter anymore. We have to take immediate action." Randall's jaw tightened. His mind raced. "So, what does this mean for me right now?" Danielle folded her hands. "You're suspended from active flight duty, effective immediately, pending the outcome of this investigation. We'll schedule a hearing later this week. You can have union representation, and the final decision will be made based on the evidence presented." The word suspended hit Randall like a punch in the gut. He'd convinced himself that he was untouchable. Now he felt his career teetering on a knife's edge. He tried to argue, but Greg cut him off. "Captain, this is serious. If the FAA revokes your medical or flight certification over evidence of misconduct, you could lose your license entirely. We suggest you cooperate fully." Stunned, Randall gathered his flight bag and left the office in a daze. Outside, the corridor bustled with airline personnel going about their day. He felt like an invisible force pressed on his chest. "All over some nonsense," he muttered, clinging to the belief that it was just a misunderstanding. But deep down, fear began to coil. For the first time, he realized this might not be a quick fix with a half-hearted apology. He remembered the woman's confident demeanor, her polished way of speaking. A tiny voice in his mind whispered that maybe he'd messed with the wrong person. 3 days passed. Randall Patterson spent most of that time at home, restless and anxious. He paced the living room, half watching TV, ignoring calls from co-workers who might press him for details. His wife, Sandra, tried to remain supportive, but tension crackled in every conversation. Randall's stubborn pride refused to let him share the full truth, only muttering about unfair allegations. Finally, the day of the formal hearing arrived. Randall dressed in his uniform, out of habit rather than necessity. Delta's headquarters near Hartsfield-Jackson had a suite of conference rooms used for disciplinary reviews. Randall's union representative, a veteran pilot named Charles Chas Ferguson, met him outside the main entrance. Chas spoke quietly, reminding Randall to keep calm, present facts, and avoid any show of hostility. Inside, the hearing panel consisted of Greg Hansen, Danielle Bates, an airline legal counsel, and a second HR official. To Randall's shock, Maya Caldwell was also in attendance, representing her statement as an FAA consultant. She had not expected to be physically present, but at Delta's request, she agreed to clarify any points in person. Her presence shifted the atmosphere in the room. She was not just a name on a complaint, she was a professional with composure, data, and credibility backing her claims. As the session began, Danielle recapped the allegations that Captain Patterson confronted Miss Caldwell with unwarranted hostility, appeared to question her right to assist another passenger, and used a tone perceived as racially tinged. They cited multiple flight attendant statements about Randall's past remarks and attitude. The pattern suggested deeper issues. When Randall finally got the floor, he offered a stiff defense. "I never harassed Miss Caldwell. I simply asked if there was a problem. Maybe my tone was stern, but I deny any racism or targeted hostility. If anything, I was concerned about safety protocols." He tried to downplay the flight attendant reports as miscommunications or exaggerations. But the meeting took a sharp turn when Danielle read transcripts of flight attendant interviews. One recalled hearing Randall mutter, "Great," another one playing the hero under his breath while looking at Maya. Another statement from a previous flight described him referring to certain passengers as these non-English speakers with a derisive snort. Maya, calm and articulate, then explained her perspective. "I have no personal vendetta against Captain Patterson. However, in my role, I've studied how microaggressions can escalate. This is not about a single event, it's about a pattern that could compromise passenger relations and overall flight safety. When I talk about safety, it's not just mechanical, it's human." Randall felt a surge of resentment. Hearing her speak so authoritatively in that measured tone stoked his anger. But he kept his composure, remembering Chas's warning. Instead, he tried to claim that Maya overread the situation. "She's got a background in these cultural issues, so maybe she's hypersensitive." Maya held his gaze. "Perhaps I am sensitive, Captain Patterson. Sensitivity in this context is an asset. It helps prevent major conflicts in flight. It ensures no passenger or crew member is marginalized. If you interpret that as a problem, then that speaks to the core issue here." A hush fell in the room. The panelists exchanged glances, sensing the gravity of the exchange. Even Randall's union rep looked uneasy, recognizing that Patterson was stepping on a landmine. Greg Hansen cleared his throat. "Captain, we appreciate your input, but the facts remain. You've had multiple warnings about your conduct. Miss Caldwell's account lines up with existing patterns. We cannot ignore this." After more deliberation, the panel stepped out to confer. When they returned, the airline legal counsel read the decision. Randall Patterson would be terminated from Delta Airlines due to violation of the company's code of conduct and multiple instances of discriminatory or hostile behavior. The FAA was also reviewing the matter. Depending on the outcome, his pilot's license could be suspended or revoked. For a moment, Randall's world collapsed. He stood there, breath caught in his throat, as Danielle handed him an official letter. When he looked at the signature line, he saw Maya Caldwell's name as a contributing signatory representing the FAA's affirmation of the complaint. She had, quite literally, helped sign the document that ended his 2-decade career in the cockpit. News spread quickly among flight crews and staff at Delta. Whispered conversations in break rooms spoke of Captain Patterson's downfall. Some felt pity, acknowledging that he was a talented pilot with an unblemished safety record. Others, especially those who'd endured his barbed comments, felt a justified sense of relief that his attitude was no longer tolerated. Meanwhile, Randall returned home to an empty house. Sandra was at work. In a burst of fury, he hurled his flight cap across the living room. The uniform that once defined him now felt like a hollow symbol. His phone pinged incessantly. Colleagues texted, some offering sympathy, others prying for details. He ignored most of them. It took hours for him to calm down enough to read the termination letter thoroughly. Seeing Maya Caldwell's name there triggered a complex whirl of anger and guilt. Had he really allowed one heated moment, fed by years of brewing prejudice, to undo everything? In his mind, she was the villain, though a small voice kept asking if perhaps the real villain was his own arrogance. "The union rep," Chas Ferguson called. "Randall, I'm sorry," he said. "We can try to file an appeal, but with the FAA involved, I'm not optimistic. My advice is to lay low and maybe consider other aviation avenues, corporate flying, cargo, something. But if the FAA pulls your license, that's out." Randall's hands trembled around the phone. He mumbled a half-hearted thanks and ended the call. The union couldn't save him now. For the first time since he was a teenager, he faced the possibility that he might never fly commercially again. Over the next week, official paperwork flew between Delta's HR department and the FAA. Maya was not personally involved in every step, but her testimony and signature stood as cornerstones of the case. She read the follow-up reports with an uneasy heart. She'd never taken pleasure in seeing someone's career dismantled, but accountability was crucial. She also began to receive calls from flight attendants and other staff who'd witnessed Randall Patterson's behavior over the years, thanking her for speaking up. One flight attendant recounted an incident where Patterson belittled a non-English speaker, leaving the passenger in tears. Another recalled how he once made a veiled remark about affirmative action hires when referencing a black co-pilot. Their stories solidified for Maya that this was not a single, isolated event, but a pattern requiring strong corrective action. Then came the public statement from Delta Airlines, crafted carefully to avoid legal entanglements. They cited a violation of company policies related to ethical conduct and respect for passengers. They reaffirmed their commitment to diversity and inclusion. Internally, memos circulated reminding staff that discriminatory behavior would not be tolerated, regardless of rank or tenure. Though it never reached mainstream national news, aviation circles buzzed with the story. Some pilots grumbled privately, resenting overzealous HR measures. But a growing number recognized that while tough discipline might feel harsh, it served to reinforce an environment where every passenger and employee deserved respect. Randall, for his part, found himself increasingly isolated. Over the following weeks he tried applying to other airlines, only to be politely turned away. He considered smaller charter companies, but as soon as they performed a background check, they would discover the termination. His once sterling reputation as a pilot meant little now that the label of discrimination complaint hovered over him. At night, he spiraled into regret and bitterness. Anger at Maya Caldwell consumed him. He even considered drafting a letter blaming her for his misfortune. But each time he sat down to write, he realized the system had validated her account flight attendants, management, union reps, the FAA. Could they all be conspiring against him? The logic faltered. Sandra tried to encourage him to seek therapy or at least counseling to process his emotions. He rejected the idea at first, but the isolation grew heavy. Eventually, in a desperate attempt to save his marriage and his sanity, he relented. Maybe talking through his deep-seated biases would help him see how he'd arrived at this point. Ironically, it was the first step on a journey he never thought he'd take, one of introspection and possible change. Weeks became months, and Randall Patterson's life took on a stark new reality. Gone were the days of packing a flight bag to command a Boeing 737. Instead, he delved into personal reflection, something he'd resisted for years. Therapy sessions forced him to confront childhood messages, unexamined biases, and the toxic pride he had clung to. He wrestled with the knowledge that he'd been undone by his own hand, by a cruel synergy of arrogance and prejudice. Sandra watched her husband vacillate between remorse and resentment. Some days he seemed genuinely contrite, recognizing that he had harbored harmful views. Other days he railed against political correctness, refusing to see the difference between enforced politeness and genuine respect. She encouraged him to stay on the path of introspection, but change didn't happen overnight. Meanwhile, Maya Caldwell pressed forward with her work. She co-led new collaborative efforts between the FAA and multiple airlines, rolling out improved training modules that included real-world examples, some of which came from the myriad testimonies she collected. She never once mentioned Randall Patterson by name in public forums. Instead, she used the lessons gleaned from his case to illustrate the consequences of unchecked bias. A cautionary tale without reveling in it. Eventually, word reached Maya that the FAA had suspended Patterson's commercial pilot license. It wasn't a permanent revocation, but it barred him from flying commercially until he could complete a rigorous re-education program and demonstrate a changed attitude. Whether he would do so remained uncertain. The old Randall Patterson might have scoffed at such a notion, but the new Randall Patterson, worn down by losing his dream job, might have enough humility to try. In an ironic twist, parts of the training he needed to undergo had been crafted or influenced by Maya's modules. Had he known that every step to reclaim his license was steeped in the very philosophy he once derided, he might have refused on principle. But necessity can be a powerful motivator. Late one afternoon, Maya received an anonymous note in her email inbox that read, "I wanted to say, I'm sorry for how I treated you on that flight. I won't sign this message because I'm still ashamed of who I was, but I hope you know I'm trying to be better." Though it wasn't explicitly stated, she recognized its possible origin. She pondered replying, but it was a no-reply address. She closed her laptop, exhaling softly. A small kernel of relief found its way into her thoughts. Some part of him, at least, acknowledged the harm he had caused. That night, she looked out the window of her Atlanta condo, thinking about how fragile a pilot's career could be, not just from mechanical failures or health issues, but from moral failures. Racism had clipped Randall Patterson's wings more effectively than any mechanical malfunction ever could. And yet, she held no personal desire to see him permanently grounded. Aviation, in her eyes, was about connecting people across cultures, across oceans. If Randall Patterson could truly transform, perhaps one day he'd find a place in the skies again. But that journey was his alone. In the end, the story of Captain Randall Patterson turned into more than just a disciplinary footnote. It became a milestone in the ongoing push for better pilot training in communication, empathy, and cultural awareness. No longer could airlines brush aside minor incidents of disrespect or discrimination as if they had no bearing on safety. Passengers and crew alike deserved better, and the industry was slowly waking up to that truth. For Maya Caldwell, life continued with her unwavering mission to build bridges in an environment that soared thousands of feet in the air, yet was too often weighed down by old prejudices. She carried on, resolved and steadfast, ever more convinced that accountability was not cruelty, but kindness. Because in the delicate realm of aviation, even the smallest shift in attitude could ultimately save lives. Actions have a way of catching up with us, and Randall Patterson discovered this truth the hardest way possible. After years of unchecked bias, his confrontation with Maya Caldwell, an influential FAA consultant, triggered the ultimate fall from grace. Where he once believed his rank and tenure made him untouchable, he now stood grounded, stripped of the wings he prized above all else. Yet within this harsh lesson lies a glimmer of hope. Transformation can happen when we confront our flaws head-on. And for those watching, consider how easily we can choose respect over prejudice. If this story resonated with you, if it provoked thought or stirred emotions, please show your support. Like this video, share it with your community, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can create change by refusing to accept discrimination even at 35,000 feet. Let's keep our skies and our hearts open